For this episode of the series, we're going to be rebuilding this MP122 transfer case out of our 2007 Silverado. But before we start tearing this thing apart, let's have a quick recap of what the symptoms were. The first symptom that appeared would actually be the metal shavings in the transfer case fluid when we changed it at around 60,000 miles. The next symptom that appeared was a driveline clunk in reverse that occurred under heavy throttle application. As time went on, less and less throttle application was required until it would actually do it at idle. The reversing issue was the main concern, but then there were two other small things that occurred before the grinding that made us stop driving the truck. In the last 2 or 3 months of driving the truck before taking it off the road, we noticed that sometimes the ABS would activate, seemingly for no reason, when coming to a stop. This next symptom, which only occurred once, served as a pretty direct clue. When driving at around 30 miles an hour, the speedometer stopped reading and the truck stopped accelerating. It basically cruised to a stop like it was in neutral. After shifting into park and turning the truck off and on again, everything worked normally. Since the speedometer and shifting is electronically controlled on this truck, that really indicates an issue with the vehicle speed sensor. And the vehicle speed sensor is, you guessed it, in the transfer case. And then, the last time the truck was driven, on 2 occasions there were loud grinding sounds that could be heard coming from the drivetrain. This occurred in both drive and overdrive while on the highway. That was the final straw. What I eventually came across when trying to find somebody else who had had this issue was this video. It showed a 2007 2500 Silverado demonstrating the exact same reversing issue that I had been experiencing. And luckily, the poster of the video mentioned in the comments something about the snap ring in the transfer case breaking and causing the issue. From there, I searched for a snap ring problem relating to these trucks and came across this service bulletin. The bulletin sure sounds like the issue I had been experiencing, and it's listed for this year of truck. This particular bulletin seems to be directed at the NQH transfer cases, but it probably applies to the whole lineup. The transfer case my Silverado has is an NQG. As near as I can tell, the only difference between the NQH MP3023 transfer case and the NQG MP122 transfer case is electronic versus manual shifting. And that service bulletin mentions the same broken snap ring as the video poster. So, we finally have a good idea of what the problem with the transfer case might be, and hopefully we can just replace the snap ring and be on our way. Although, since the truck has had this issue since even before I owned it, it seems likely that we're going to need to replace more parts than just a snap ring. And with all that out of the way, let's get to work. The transfer case is still sitting on the transmission jack and held up by the engine crane, so the first thing we'll need to do is remove the chains and get everything set on the ground. We're going to start off this rebuild working on the ground because at this time the transmission was still hogging the bench. For the sake of these videos, it made more sense to show the transmission rebuild and then the transfer case rebuild, even though they actually happened at the same time. If the pressure washer was still working at this point, the first thing we do is spray the whole thing down. Clearly, the truck has gotten a little bit dirty. Instead of really scrubbing the whole thing down, all we'll do for now is break off the biggest pieces of dirt. The first thing we'll do is remove the transfer case adapter seal. Then we need to remove the 6 nuts that are holding the transfer case adapter to the transfer case. The impact gun and sockets I have couldn't quite reach them all, so we'll just have to loosen some of them with a good old-fashioned wrench. 2 of the nuts also hold on this harness bracket, so once they're removed, the bracket can come off. And with all the fasteners removed, a rubber mallet will help us break loose the adapter. And once it's broken loose, we can carefully wiggle it away from the transfer case. The extension housing gasket completely cracked apart, so we'll remove all the big pieces of that right now. Then, in order to remove the extension housing studs, we'll thread back on 2 of the nuts we just removed, tighten them against each other, and then we can loosen off the entire stud. Then we'll loosen the nuts and remove the other 5 studs in the same way. And with those removed, while everything is nice and accessible, we'll go ahead and use a razor blade to clean off the rest of the gasket material. Next, we'll remove the shift lever bolt, and then pull off the shift lever. We'll also go ahead and remove the fill and drain plugs. Look at how much metal is on that drain magnet again. There are also these 2 large pieces stuck to it. I managed to lose those pieces immediately after this shot, so I couldn't confirm, but I think they're actually plastic and they're just so covered in that metallic oil they appear to be metal. These steel filings make for a nice toy, but they're definitely not what you want your car to be manufacturing. The next thing we're going to do is remove all of the bolts that are holding the two halves of the transfer case together. There are 17 of these bolts around the perimeter of the transfer case, and we will remove them in a loosely crisscross pattern. There's also one bolt on the top side which is holding on this harness bracket. And once all the case bolts are out, we need to separate the two halves of the case. The first thing we'll try is the usual method, and we'll take a rubber mallet and just give the whole thing a beating. Because these cases use a sealant between the two halves and not a gasket, the case halves can be pretty difficult to separate. If the hammer method is failing, as it was here, it can help to get a little creative. What we'll do is utilize these 3 tabs located around the perimeter of the case. In each one, we'll install a bolt of just the right length and loosen a nut off of that bolt until it's pressed against the tabs on the case. By doing this, we've turned each of those bolts into a powerful press that's pushing the case halves apart. If you look closely here, you'll see it didn't take a lot of torque to start forming a gap. And with those 3 bolts in place, we'll once again give the whole case a few taps. It's a little hard to tell what's happening, but when we go around and turn each of those fasteners a bit more, they're each easier to turn than they were before. That means things should be starting to separate. And once we've adjusted all 3 of those bolts, we'll give everything a few more taps and we can finally see a significant gap forming. And as we go back to adjust each fastener a little bit more, the case starts to separate. But even after some more persuasion with the mallet, some of the sealant was still holding the case together. In order to separate that last little bit, we'll give it a few taps with a sharp chisel. Note that we're trying to keep the chisel away from the sealing surface and staying on the outside edge of these bolt hole areas, until we're finally just a few taps away from getting the sealant fully separated. Before we go any farther, we'll also pop off the clamp and finish removing the front drive shaft boot. We'll go ahead and separate the case halves a bit more until we can see all the parts we're working with. That makes it much easier to manipulate parts until they're in a position where they can be easily separated. Take your time with this step, as it's also your last chance to see how everything is assembled before it comes apart. A transfer case like this is much simpler than something like a transmission, but we still want to keep all our parts in order. So in trying to keep things organized, we'll set aside the chain-driven sprocket spacer and the shift fork spring, which fell out into the case when the halves were separated. Then we'll slide the shift control shaft out of the 2 forks. And we'll pull the range shift fork out of the case. This fork is clearly damaged, but we'll set that aside for now. And then we'll pull out the shift mode fork. And we can also remove the driven sprocket and chain from the transfer case. It doesn't take long to notice that the output shaft is a little bit loose. All of that play you're seeing is in that rear output shaft bearing. That bearing is definitely toast. And next up, we need to get that rear output shaft assembly removed from the case. If we peek in between the rear output shaft and its seal, we can see that its rear bearing retaining ring is broken. We'll go ahead and get our chisel back out and remove the rear output shaft seal. For our rebuild, we're going to be replacing all of the seals on the transfer case, so we can remove these destructively. But of course, we want to make sure we don't damage any parts of the transfer case other than the seal itself. It was a bit of a fight removing this seal, but it came off in the usual way. Once we formed a gap between the seal and the case with the chisel, we can get the pliers in there and pry the seal out of place. And with that removed, we'll get an even better look at that broken retaining ring. Since the snap ring is broken but miraculously still in place, we can't just push the output shaft out of the case. So what we'll do is remove these 2 access hole plugs from the case half so that we can get a tool in and remove that rear bearing outer retaining ring. This can be pretty tricky, but a nice long pair of horseshoe snap ring pliers will make removing the ring much easier. But it definitely could be done with 2 long flathead screwdrivers and a bit of finesse. We can use a flathead screwdriver through the speed sensor hole to pry up very lightly against the back of the tone ring until the retaining ring is completely out of the groove on the bearing. This can be a bit tricky and is especially weird in this case because of how loose that rear bearing has become. What we'll do is hold the retaining ring as open as possible and give the output shaft a few firm taps with a rubber mallet. Once the bearing had shifted as far forward in the case as it wanted to go, we gave the output shaft a few hard pulls and it came right out. Now, to disassemble the output shaft, the first thing we need to do is remove that rear bearing. And now that it's out of the case, we can see exactly how messed up that bearing is. It's actually pretty amazing that the bearing still spins freely and easily. That retaining ring is broken in such a way that we can't just use snap ring pliers, so we'll go ahead and take a flathead screwdriver and try to hammer the pieces out of the groove. And with those finally out of the way, we'll use that same flat blade screwdriver and twist it in between the base of the tone ring and the inside of the bearing in order to pry the inner race off of the output shaft. And after some tapping and a bit more prying and even more tapping, eventually the bearing was finally released. And then we'll go ahead and remove another bearing from the case, this time the front output shaft rear bearing. As this one is a press fit against the back of the case, it can be a bit tricky to remove. Basically, grab a pry bar, a mallet, and some screwdrivers and use the 2 slots on the outside edge to work the bearing out of its bore. Of course, you'll want to avoid hammering or significant prying against the inner race of the bearing. Ball bearings are great at handling radial loads, but they're not always the best with axial loads. And after some back and forth, the bearing finally leaps out of the case. And with that out, we'll also remove the rear output shaft bearing outer retaining ring. It takes a little bit of prying, but it comes out of its groove without a fight. And with that, the rear case half is just about disassembled. And back on the front half, we can slide out the internal shift detent lever. And then the shift detent plunger and shift detent spring will pull out of the case. And then we can slide the range clutch hub out of the range planetary carrier. Well, it's supposed to slide out. This one is pretty stuck. That's not great. Well, what we can do is remove the range internal gear retaining ring, although there's not a whole lot of reason to since that internal gear is pressed into the case and never coming out. But we might as well take the ring out to check for damage and make sure we can get everything clean. And next, we'll move to the very front of the case and remove the input shaft seal. This type's a bit tricky since there's no metal lip to use to pry it out. What ended up working for this one was cocking it sideways in the bore, and then once one side was high enough out of the case, it was able to be pulled out by hand. And with the seal out of the way, we can see the input shaft and planetary carrier retaining ring. We'll use a standard pair of snap ring pliers to open the ring up and let the input shaft and planetary carrier fall into the case. And with that assembly removed, we can once again try to slide the range clutch hub out of the planetary carrier. But nope, it's still not interested in coming apart. So before we pull that out, we'll remove the retaining ring holding the input shaft to the planetary carrier. Once one edge of the ring is pried up, we can work our way around to remove the whole thing from its groove. And with the retaining ring removed, the input shaft, which is also the sun gear in this case, will lift out of the planetary carrier. The range locking plate and front input shaft thrust washer will come out with the input shaft, and then we'll remove the rear input shaft thrust washer from the planetary carrier. And then we'll set the carrier up on 2x4s so that we can hammer out the range clutch hub. Remember, this piece is supposed to slide easily. And finally, those two are separated, so we'll return to disassembling the case. The next thing we'll do is remove the snap ring holding in the input shaft bearing. This retaining ring was difficult to remove even with the large snap ring pliers. Because of the shape of the ring, what helped to remove it was prying against the opposite side while compressing the ring. And now that that's removed, we can also press out the input shaft bearing. After a little bit of prying to get it started, a few hits from a flat blade screwdriver and a bit of persuasion from the pry bar, it dropped out pretty easily. And next up was removing the seal for the front output shaft. This is a bit of an unusual seal, and it's sort of a two-part deal. It's sort of comprised of two separate seals, the smaller of which is pressed onto the output shaft. Presumably related to some of the dunking underwater, the inner part of the seal is severely stuck to the output shaft. In total, it took almost 40 minutes to remove this seal, so in the interest of time, we'll skip around a little bit. First, we tried to remove the outside part of the seal simply by separating the lip from the case. This worked a little bit, but since the two seals are attached and the inside one was not budging, it could only go so far. So we ended up with the outside lip of the seal completely torn apart. Then we tried applying a lot of heat and penetrating fluid to the seal. But since the bearing on the other side has a plastic cage, we didn't want to go all out and risk melting it. At this point, the outer part of the seal was pretty loose, but the smaller inner part was still stuck. Since at this point we were all in on destroying the thing, we went ahead and started drilling holes in the seal. But just like with the heat, we had to be very careful not to go too far and hit that bearing. Once we had drilled that hole in it, we tried to use it to move the inner part of the seal around, or at least deform it so much that it comes off. But boy did this thing not want to relent. You can see here we're tearing the steel apart and the seal still hasn't moved. So we drilled another hole in the opposite side and repeated the same process. And then more of the same, hammering, a little more drilling, hammering, and prying, and it finally moved a tiny bit. And following that, it took a bit more hammering and a lot more prying, but eventually the seal finally relented and came off. And with the seal out of the way, at long last we can remove the front output shaft. and then we'll start separating the bearing using a sharp chisel. Once it's started to move, we'll prop it up on 2x4s and just give it a few taps with a mallet to completely separate the two. And now we'll move on to taking apart the output shaft assembly. First, we can twist the oil pump pickup tube out of the pump. And then we can remove the rear output shaft bearing front retaining ring using snap ring pliers. Using a flathead to help push the ring out of its groove made this much easier. Then we can slide off the reluctor wheel, followed by the oil pump, from which we can remove this spring steel ring. This is another clip where it's not really necessary to remove it, but we'll go ahead and do it anyway. In these transfer cases, the bodies of the oil pump are crimped together and they cannot be disassembled. Next, we can remove the chain drive sprocket retaining ring. This pair of large, angled snap ring pliers made it a little easier, but these rings are still fairly tough to remove. In this case, the ring only came partway off and needed a little bit of extra persuasion. And with that out of the way, we can slide off the chain drive sprocket spacer and the chain drive sprocket. Then there are just a few more things to remove, including the shift mode synchro hub, the 3 synchro blocking rings, and the 3 synchro inserts. And then finally, the shift mode synchro sleeve. And with that, we're basically done with this assembly. So now we'll move on to cleaning up, inspecting, and replacing parts. We'll start with the oil pump. This transmission uses a gear rotor style oil pump that, as previously mentioned, is not designed to be disassembled. It is very uncommon for these pumps to fail, even in a metallic fluid heavy environment like this one was in. What we're going to do is wipe down the oil pump and then run some fresh fluid through it to clean out the old stuff. We'll lightly clamp the oil pump in the vise and then insert the rear output shaft. The output shaft has already been sprayed down with brake cleaner and wiped mostly clean. And with that fully installed, we'll put a little bit of oil in the pump to prime it. And then we'll fill up a container with enough transmission fluid to submerge the pickup tube. And then we'll install the other end of the pickup tube into the oil pump. And what we'll do here is wrap a strip of toolbox liner around the output shaft splines so that we can slide a socket over it and have a nice secure fit. And we'll use a 1/2-inch adapter in the power drill to turn the whole thing. And now, supporting the end of the output shaft with one hand, we can turn the oil pump and watch it work. And then as we turn the output shaft, fresh oil is pumped through the whole system and we can visually confirm that the pump is working, based on, the mess we're making. So that was fun, albeit entirely unnecessary, so we'll get back to really cleaning up our transfer case parts. What you're seeing here is how we'll clean most of these parts. We'll spray them down with brake cleaner, wipe them off, and give them a close inspection. But some parts, especially ones with splines, teeth, or fine details, are gonna need a little bit of extra work. All that metal gunk in the fluid is pretty stuck on, so a lot of parts will be brushed off by hand. We'll also be using Scotch-Brite to refinish sealing surfaces, especially ones that are really messed up, like the seal surface on the front output shaft. That rust is from the steel inner part of that seal, and that's why it was so difficult to remove. But at least it's looking much better now. As for the front output shaft splines, yeah, there's a bit of rust in there too. We'll do the best we can and try to clean it up with a wire brush. Then, of course, the part gets a thorough cleaning. If we look inside the input shaft, we can see the pilot bearing. It looks pretty immaculate and there are no signs that anything is wrong, so we won't attempt to remove it. We'll just spray it out really thoroughly and make sure to work some transmission fluid in there before we reassemble everything. And before we clean the case, there are 2 more things to remove from the front half. First is the shift control switch assembly. Then we'll turn the case around and remove the shift detent plunger plug. And with those removed, that's almost everything for the front half. Just like the pilot bearing, the needle bearings for the shift lever seem fine and we won't be removing them. We'll just spray them out thoroughly with brake cleaner and make sure to pre-lube them with transmission fluid when assembling. There's also the shift lever seal right there, which we didn't remove at this point because we thought the seal kit didn't include a new one. But eventually we realized we do have a new seal for it and we'll take that out as well. And now that we're cleaning up the case halves, we'll use a razor blade to scrape off any remaining sealant. As you can see, the main sealing area of the transfer case isn't actually smooth, it's been milled with a crosshatch pattern. The surface finish gives the silicone sealer something to really grab onto, but it also means it's almost impossible to get it 100% clean. So be careful with the blade and try not to take off any aluminum. As long as the surface is reasonably clean and reasonably flat, it won't have any problem sealing. And we'll clean the other half of the case in the same way. To get the sealant off the edges of the threaded holes, we'll turn a countersink bit by hand, and that will clean most of it up. And since the retaining ring is off, we can take a close look at the range internal gear. The gear teeth look good and the splines holding it in place haven't moved. We didn't expect to see anything wrong here, but at least we know it looks good. We'll also use Scotch-Brite to clean up the seal and bearing bores in the case. This refinishing of the bores is a good idea as it can help ensure a good seal and make the new ones easier to install. The rear output shaft sealing surface needed a bit of special attention since there was a lot of corrosion around the edge. So first we'll clean up the surface with a razor blade and then use Scotch-Brite. When cleaning here we were careful not to touch that rear bushing, although once we got a good look at it, it was clear it should be replaced. Besides just the surface finish, we cleaned it up and slotted in the rear drive shaft and found it had a bit more play than we'd like to see. And so, since we're going to be replacing that bushing, we'll go ahead and knock it out right now. We'll push it out from the inside of the case by hammering on a socket and extension. And pretty soon, the bushing was out of the case. Now we can get a very up-close look at that surface finish. Even more so than when looking at it inside the case, it's clear that this bushing is toast. Undoubtedly, this damage is a result of that rear bearing failure, although all the contamination in the oil certainly didn't help. And with the bushing out, we'll also clean up that bore in the case with Scotch-Brite. And of course, before we put any clean parts back in here, both halves of the case will have to be scrubbed clean. For big parts, usually my cleaning method of choice is the pressure washer and or soapy water. But since we're not removing those needle bearings, we didn't want to put water anywhere near this thing. Also, every corner and wall of the case was completely caked with metal powder. So we took our time and used brake clean and paper towels to wipe everything clean. And even though there are no parts we're worried about on the other half, we'll clean it in the same way. This fine metal gunk was absolutely everywhere and pretty tough to remove. But eventually we got everything pretty clean. We're almost ready to check out our damaged parts and get some new ones and then put it all back together, but that'll have to wait for the next episode. I debated showing this in the episode, but I think this is pretty important. This is me doing something stupid out of frustration. I'm using a steel hammer on that hardened steel output shaft. Did you miss that? You might have, because it was only visible for a frame. That little itty bitty spark is a little chip coming off the end of the output shaft. I was wearing eye protection at the time, but it didn't prevent that tiny piece of metal from embedding itself in my ear. Luckily there wasn't actually much damage done to me or the output shaft, but this is definitely a lesson worth remembering.
What did we learn here today?